All right, everyone. My name is Randy Harrington, and this is my daughter Chelsea. And she and I were talking last night. Her area of expertise gives her an advantage in talking about behaviors that we've only hinted at when it comes to these creatures that we're dealing with. And the idea that they may be closer related to humans than animals opens up a whole new avenue of thought that she is actually an expert in. And it didn't occur to me until last night when we were speaking about the subject of the insight that she really does have. So I'd like to turn the floor over to Chelsea, and she can give us her experiences, her schooling, her work history. You can reveal as much as you want to, or you can suppress as much as you want to, whatever you're comfortable with, and then we'll just kind of go into the story after that.
Okay, so I got my bachelor's degree in social work, and this was probably 11 years ago, 12 years ago now. But I've always had an interest in human behavior and observing and studying humans. I've worked with people starting at 14, volunteering as a counselor, working at the old folks home, and working in the senior behavioral health unit at St. John's doing candy striping. So at a young age, being just very interested in how humans interact and build relationships. And in 2017, graduated with my master's in social work and specialized in working with young adults in their first episode of psychosis. So really learning a lot about trauma and how our brain functions and all of these things that we as humans can experience when our brain kind of fractures in that way. So what interests me about this topic of Sasquatch being more closely related to human is that I think it explains a lot more of their behavior. And if we can apply some of this more human behavior thought to, like, theories behind that to how they're behaving, I think it increases your odds of being able to actually interact with one.
Or having a better understanding of what's happening.
Well, right, yes.
Well,
So
if we can lay a little bit of the pre-story in, of course, Chelsea being my daughter, fortunately or unfortunately, she's had to listen to about 20 years or more of me doing nothing but non-stop Bigfoot chitter chatter.
well, listen, so I guess it would have been when I was like 14, 33 now. So yeah. Almost 20 years.
And needless to say, so she's been into this subject by proxy, just because I talk about it so much and I things like that. But even with her education and her experiences in dealing with people's minds and things like that, she is also very familiar with the potential of trauma that comes along with a Bigfoot encounter, because she herself was with me in the Kiamichi Mountains when something happened that, and I can tell you, Chelsea and Julie were the ones that had tears in their eyes when they were trying to get so fast on the four-wheeler to get out of there. So she's fully aware of the trauma that's at least perceived during something that's happening that you don't understand.
Right.
So she does have those physical experiences.
When you spend your whole life being told by society that this thing does not exist, this is mythological, or this is, just, it doesn't exist, and then you have an experience that everyone around you tells you is not real, how do you reconcile that? It's really hard, and you have to be so true and authentic with yourself and know what you experienced, or it's too easy to then gaslight yourself and, oh, I didn't hear that you explain it away. And I mean, yeah, I still think about that, jumping on the four-wheeler with Mom and just bolting out of there.
Yeah, well, so, we're gonna get pretty in-depth in your thought processes on this whole thing, but just so that people have that going into this conversation with them, when they were 14 or 15?
14.
14.
Yeah.
When she was 14 and her sister was 12 or 13, we all were down in the Kiamichis, and I hadn't had my Ridgewalker video yet or the base camp. This was one of the first times I'd been down there with my family. We rented a cabin and we had 2 4-wheelers, and so we went up to the northwest from Honabi up into the foothills of the mountains there, and we were just gonna sit on a logging road, make s'mores, and let them talk. And from what I had read at that point, I was hoping to use them as bait, to draw something in. I know for a fact that they weren't fully vested that these things were even possible. They lived with the fact that I believed it and was trying to prove it, and that was at the very beginning of my search. So they were placating me at that point, but it wasn't unenjoyable to be out having a little campfire on a logging road on the side of a mountain with a deep gully holler below us, and just sitting around in a couple of chairs and making s'mores till about 10:30 at night. It was well dark, and I was just above them on the hillside above them with my back to the tree line that was above us, and I just said, hey, I'm gonna hit this tree and see what happens. And and they give me that look that, okay, yeah, whatever.
But for me, I remember when we were all sitting there and you were like, okay, I'm gonna go up here, and I'm like, okay, you're leaving? What? And just like already feeling nervous. And you were like, okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and do a tree knock. And it was so loud, and my heart was beating I just remember sitting there, my heart was beating so fast, and I was like, I really hope I don't hear anything. And then to hear that knock reply, and it was so close. Right.
I know.
and I just remember your face, like you were like,
right.
And that's all I remember.
So I'm trying to process, my God, this thing is right in the shadows below them. Something is right in the shadows, right down there on the other side of the logging road, just below the girls. And they went into an immediate panic. And it was a scramble mode. It was scrambled. Julie was already on the 4-wheeler, and I'm trying to say, slow down, because I was armed, so I had a sidearm, and so I was like, I said, calm down, but they weren't having it. Julie was already on the 4-wheeler, and it was started up, and Chelsea was airborne to jump on the back. Yeah. And so that left poor Ashley waiting on me, while Julie and Chelsea are already scooting on down the road at about 45 miles an hour. I had to kick out the fires, and with Ashley in frantic mode at that point, because something is right there in the shadows below her, and she's on the back of my seat. So I can only imagine her panic at the time. And so we got out of there. So the whole story is kind of funny in retrospect, but it was real, and the trauma is real. Even half of it's made up in your head, the trauma is still real.
And what I'm thinking about now too is, even retelling that story, my heart started to beat really fast. I felt that in my body the way I felt then at 14. And we store all of that, we hold all of that, and when we replay these traumas, it comes back up in our bodies. Absolutely.
When you say that, I felt the exact same thing when we went to the Omaha Zoo. And I went to the silverback gorilla exhibit, which had just a plexiglass between, and he was sitting there with his back against the plexiglass, and I walked over to it, so I was a mere foot away from him, and he's sitting there, and I'm behind him, I'm just admiring the muscles, and and of course I'm comparing him to Bigfoot, the Bigfoot that I saw at Chickasaw Park. And he slowly turned his head and looked at me, and I went woozy. The trauma I felt at that moment where he turned his head and looked at me with just a foot between us. I went woozy, and it took me back to the night at the Chickasaw Park.
Yeah.
So it's amazing how you are hanging on to that stuff, and certain triggers will bring it out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, so if you think about even like when you return to these campsites or return to these areas where you have had experiences that you can't explain or society tells you didn't happen, all of that's coming back up, and you may not realize it, but it's coming back up in your body, and we hold on to all of that for sure.
And that's where we come into when we had this discussion last night, where you were talking about we need to think of these things more like our pre-ancestors, which were hunter-gatherers, and so they didn't have the idea of telephones and all of the external things that we can think about here as modern men. Think of way back then, all they had was, I gotta get some food to eat today.
Yep.
I mean, they probably weren't into washing clothes. They didn't have things. Shelter,
food.
Right. So when they were out hunting, she brought this up last night, which to me is amazing to think this through like that, where these things had to develop the skills, because back then they didn't have knives. All they had was maybe a club or a spear. Maybe they were advanced enough to have bow and arrow, but I doubt it at that point. So their hunting had to be so stealthy, where they sit motionless and quiet until something got close enough that they could get. So think of how long it took them to develop and learn that paying attention, being completely motionless and silent, sitting in the bushes and the structures. They may have learned to build structures themselves as hunting blinds, but the thought processes was that they had to spend hours and hours and hours of silence, paying attention and being acutely aware of the noises and the sounds of what's happening in the woods around them. And Chelsea brought this up to me last night, and it was like a light bulb popped on over my head. That's the way a Bigfoot seems to behave.
Yep. So I relate them absolutely to that, and thinking even of like the voluntarily isolated populations, indigenous populations of like the Amazon that do not have human interaction other than their own tribe. They are not immune. They know other people exist. They're not living in some isolated bubble where they don't know that there's an outside world. They see planes go overhead. Bigfoot see planes go overhead. So I imagine they function similarly. They are their own tribe. So I have some notes here. So if we think of how we are in our own home, you know how you left a pile of books. You know how you left your charger station. You know how you left your coffee. You know how Julie leaves the coffee or where she leaves things. You know dog poop on the floor versus if a cat poops on the floor. You recognize the difference because it is your home. This is your environment. That is exactly what they're doing. They maybe have sections of woods that are their sections, and this is the land that they understand. They know how they left their phone booth station. They know how that rock was left there. So if somebody comes up and messes with it, that's not their cousin, they're like, this is not how things were before. They are acutely and keenly aware of what's happening in their environment. And so it makes sense too when you've talked before about they're watching you. So if you go to one of their phone booth stations with their rock and you mess around with something across, they're probably already watching you. And they're
Right.
like, well, what's he doing over there?
And for the sake of clarity for any of the listeners out there, I want to tell you what we're calling a phone booth station. And that is, and we didn't know until recently that it was even possible or probable that that's what's happening when you hear knocks up on a ridge late at night. Certainly it doesn't mean that it's happening every time, but it could be happening some of the time. And that is, we had an extremely loud tree knock that happened at a particular time at the 400. A couple of days later, find some tracks back in an area that involved not only tracks, but a hole being dug. And in that area, we found a rock sitting on top of a log that was running parallel to the ground, about 2 feet up. The branches were holding it up off the ground, but something had a rock sitting on top of that log. When Shane hit that log with that rock, the percussion sounded like the one that we'd heard from that area a couple of nights before. And so we did some tests to see if they sounded similar, and indeed they did. But the fact is, there's a rock sitting on top of a log that can only get there one way, either human or something else put it there. So with the other anecdotal evidence of hearing a knock and having it come from that location and then finding that rock on top of the log, that makes us think that was set up by them. Do they leave the rock there on purpose? Do they want to use that again? And then Shane starts to remember the times on that property, and he's got pictures of them where he has found rocks in the lower forks of trees, specific trees up on the ridges and things. And it's like you start saying to yourself, my God, these things may have had these stations set up to where they already know they've got 3 stations along the top of that ridge. And when Dad says, I need you to go clear that ridge over there and make sure there's nothing going on that I need to worry about because I'm going to be hunting tonight. So when Junior goes over there and Dad hears a knock coming from over there, he knows exactly where it's coming from because they've pre-set it up. They know where their phone booths are located, and we've found more than one at the 400 that shows they're doing this on purpose.
Right.
That is incredibly to dissect what we're finding and try to put behaviors behind it. That makes me excited.
Well, so to add on to that, if we think of them as more humanoid and that they have this communication skill, they have some kind of language, whether it's whoops, hollers, whistles, like they have some kind of language, then would it be totally out of the box to assume perhaps that they pass on stories, culture, tradition, the same way we all as humans have done throughout all of time?
Well, that would be the only way that I could describe getting 2 gifts returned in rock cairns.
Right. So if they're passing on information, then it would make sense that if one great-grandfather Bigfoot has a bad experience with a human, that perhaps, or this naked Bigfoot, or however they describe us, that information gets passed on. And so then they're acutely aware of, if they see this naked Bigfoot, you don't interact with them, or they're dangerous, or if they have an experience with a hunter or something, and that information could be passed along through them. And so they're super aware and wary when they see somebody come in, when also they're used to being the predator, and so they've never had to experience something potentially coming in and harming them, because they're the top dog where they're at in their environment.
So in every other experience with every other animal in their life, they are the ones in charge. They're the ones doing the stalking. They're the ones doing the hunting. They're the ones doing the controlling. So all of a sudden, when we're in their area, that role is reversed to where they have to be extremely sketchy about us and what we're doing. And you bring up a good point when you're talking about maybe a grandfather Bigfoot passing down information that the little ones need to be aware of. Almost every newspaper article I've read from pre-1900 about wild men being seen, when you read about them in the newspapers, and I've read a lot of them, almost every one of them end with Joe Bob coming back to town saying he saw a hairy wild man in his garden. So they gather up 10 or 15 posse, and they get their guns and their torches and their pitchforks, and they go try to chase them down. Every story seemed to end that way, where we immediately turn aggressive and let's chase them down and let's rid them out of the woods and what's around Joe Bob's farm. That's showing you that we have set the relationship up that we have with them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, and bringing in now, of course, all cameras and all sorts of things. So again, if we think about how we make connections, so imagine, let's say this great-grandfather Bigfoot sees a game hunter, and that game hunter sets up a game cam, and then there's a trap somewhere, and he sees this hunter, and so he's making a connection between all three of these things. And so now anytime they see something that could resemble a camera, they assume harm comes from this thing, even though it doesn't, but they've related it to that. Just the same way we make connections, and we're trying to make sense of the world around us and make sense of things that we don't understand based on what context we have. So for them, they don't have a context for what a camera is. They just see that there's some kind of light and an animal gets harmed when this is present. And so there's a connection that we don't mess with that, or we're going to do things to see what it does and to see if it triggers something. They're trying to figure it out. Same way a human would. Absolutely.
And that makes it easier to think if you can get it out of your head that these things are just mere animals. Mm-hmm. If you can get that out of your head, then that's the moment you can think differently about what their capabilities are. And then you can have some explanations of why we don't have a body, why this, why that, why that. Well, because they're wild people and they think like people.
Yes. So that leads me into, I was doing a little bit of research on some of the Amazonian tribes. And so in 1910, there was a Brazilian military engineer who was he was stalking this station with supplies. He spent 14 months stalking this outpost. It included fruit and a vegetable garden and tools that the Nambikwara tribe, they were in the Amazon bush, that they could come in and take. It took 14 months of him doing this and tribe members coming in and taking stuff before he finally was able to have an interaction with them. 14 months.
And these were people.
Exactly. So I, in thinking about this, feel like you got to play the long game. I mean, if it took them, so the chief of the tribe is who finally showed himself to this Brazilian military official. And so I'm thinking about how can you treat them like a tribe? How do you build a relationship? And you would do that the same way you would with any human, which is reliability, predictability, and consistency. That's what builds trust. If you think of a scared child, if you think of anyone you're trying to build a relationship with, if you come in different every time, people are going to be wary of you. I can't trust that you're going to show up the way you did last time, because every single time you show up different, you bring different things, you're doing different things, you're making different noises, so they're not trusting you. So how do you build trust with someone who doesn't trust you? So that's what I'm thinking is there a way that you could set up a gift station where every time you bring, what are things that they could use? So obviously communication. So what about lead pipes or wind chimes or things where you would recognize that noise, because then you're going to hear it later. So things that they could use to communicate, tools, food, whatever might be helpful for them, and start leaving gifts and develop more of a reciprocal relationship where you're showing up, they know when you're going to show up, you're not doing anything. I feel like to really get that interaction, it's you got to let go of some of the control you're trying to put into creating an interaction. And it's what would happen if you just kind of went back to basics and just didn't try to film one right away, but just tried to have another interaction. And when you built that relationship and you have an interaction, then you pull the wool out, you pull the rug out from under them and get them after you've built a relationship.
Well, see, and thinking about these things more in the line of the way humans develop, that gives you some answers. And the fact is, we know for a fact that not only the sighting where Shane walked out on one and the captures that we've got on thermal, and the rock throwing incident where we marked the rocks and had rocks thrown back at it, those were all done by the juveniles. So if it coincides with the development of a human child, undisciplined 12, 13-year-old, undisciplined, not experienced enough in the world to stay hidden, to still learning their way, but giving some, because of their age, giving a little more freedom from under mom and dad's umbrella. That's why the juveniles seem to be the majority of the ones we're seeing, and they're getting caught and things like that. And it just makes sense when you think about them as the same age as children, and they're trying to figure themselves out and not disciplined and
they're like, yeah, dad said that we should be worried about these guys, but I'm not worried. Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, I was thinking back to just kind of the commonality between all of the stories I've heard of where people have had interactions with them, and it's when they weren't posing as a threat. I mean, even when you, like, what was different about your experience with them climbing on the back of your truck versus what you're doing now?
Well, I based that on the fact that there was a report in the newspaper, in the sheriff's reports, that somebody had said that one was running out of their campsite when they came back to their campsite late one night. So I was only basing it on, well, it went in there because nobody was in the campsite.
But what did you do different? What were you doing? You were hidden.
Yeah.
You didn't have cameras up. You weren't a threat.
Right.
They just saw a truck with some cool stuff in the back. So I guess that's what I'm wondering is, like, what would happen if you kind of went back a little bit more to the basics and had another interaction, just had another experience, and then tried to capture it later. Because I feel like the goal now at this point has become, I gotta capture one, I gotta prove this. But every time you show up, you have all these amazing ideas and things that you want to do, but they're already on to you.
Right. Yeah.
they every time you show up, they're like, what's he got now? If they are thinking the way we do. So if you show up every single time with something different, they're not going to interact because they're trying to see, like, what does he have? What's he going to do? What's going to happen this time? There's no predictability there.
But I think, as far as for me and Shane, the only predictability is that we're never in there with guns, we're never hunting, we're never chasing bright lights, firing off guns. So even if the things around us are inconsistent, we're still consistent. That we're not. They don't have to worry too much about us doing crazy stuff and doing a lot of chasing around and that kind of stuff. So
that's true.
But I don't know how long that can maintain the relationship.
Right.
But I mean, yeah, it is what it is.
So I mean, those were some of my biggest thoughts, just like in the notes that I was taking.
Well, given your experience in dealing with crisis intervention, people with a lot of trauma and how it affects the brain, I'd like for you to touch on the subject of this arena seems to be filled up with people who are not only looking for answers, but actually seeking their own therapy without knowing that they're seeking therapy. And that is talking with like-minded people who've been through the same experiences as them and sharing those experiences to the point where it brings them comfort. Why are they looking for comfort? Well, I can understand why, because I've been looking for it for all my life. It was, since I've had those things happen. But you, not only being educated on this subject and being a counselor and a psychologist and all those things, dealing with people, and having your own trauma experience related to Bigfoot. So that you've already bridged those two subjects with yourself. But you also understand that clearly when you get into the Bigfoot world and you start looking at all these forums and people chit-chatting, that there's a lot of people who are looking to help themselves understand what they've been through.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that crazy?
And that, I mean, when you think about when you are a child, that's really kind of where where we develop our self-view and our worldview. So we develop beliefs about ourselves, about other people, and about the world around us. And these become core beliefs. So beliefs like, I can trust, if we have reliable, consistent caregivers, a belief we develop is, I can trust other people. If we have caregivers that are unreliable and don't meet our needs, then our belief becomes, I have to take care of myself, I can't trust anybody else. So if you think about these societal messages that we get starting at a young age, that again, things like Sasquatch aren't real, aliens aren't real, like all of these messages that get drilled into us, that becomes a part of our belief system. So then to have an experience
Where that's challenged.
where it's shattered, I mean, it's just that belief shatters, and that messes with you, and that is trauma, because it overwhelms your ability to cope in that moment. That is what trauma is. So I mean, anything could happen, but absolutely something that then shatters a belief system that you hold really changes your brain and changes your body. Because when we think of experiencing a trauma, if you think of an animal on National Geographic, a predator chases a prey, an antelope, and that antelope gets away from the predator. That antelope can't keep thinking about that experience, otherwise it won't go on and live its life. If it keeps reliving that trauma of like, oh my god, I almost died yesterday, let me tell you, I almost died yesterday. Like, they don't do that. So what they do to relieve that overwhelming sensation in their body is they freeze, they orient their environment, and they do that by just looking around, and they shake. They literally shake it off. Because if you think about any time you've gone through something really stressful, you get tense, because our body is gearing up to fight or run, or we gotta be frozen so that we don't get killed, so that we survive this. And then we don't let go of it. We remain tense. We hold on to that in our neck and our backs. It can turn into gut issues, because when you have that constant anxiety, it messes with your bowels, because that's an evolutionary response. Our system gears up in those moments by relieving our bowels. I mean, a lot of times there are some people, when you experience trauma, they poop their pants or they pee, because you got to get rid of that so we can run. You can't be holding on to anything extra, because you have to be ready to run. So animals let go of that, but we don't. We don't let go of it, and it turns into chronic illness. Trauma is a precursor to, I mean, and I believe anything, any sort of disorder and disease comes from trauma, and the adverse childhood experiences studies are showing that.
Well, when you and I had this discussion last night, it made me think about Shane. And Shane, when he was 10 years old, had his sighting in the woods behind his uncle's house while he was looking for the family dog. Close encounter that left him traumatized. I mean, imagine being 10 years old, Leo's age, and running back up to the house in fear of what you just saw, and having everyone at the house dismiss that you must be imagining things. Maybe it was a bear, maybe whatever, and then make you shut up about it. So even without him knowing it, when he gives that explanation of what happened to him when he was 10, he's exhibiting all of those things that you described, especially as a 10-year-old. That's not even an adult that has something trauma happen to you. That's a 10-year-old having to suppress it.
Right, and every time he had to suppress it was another trauma added to that initial trauma.
Well, just think of you and me telling our story of the knock that was close.
Mm-hmm.
We're feeling it. We're feeling it because we can go back to that moment in time. So imagine having to where you can't get it out, you can't talk about it, and you're told you're silly and you're making stuff up as a 10-year-old. And so he held on to that until 2013 when he had a second encounter, and then had to explain things to his wife and sons, and he's embraced it since then. Where he's like everybody else, where we're chasing it till we get our own answers. And so it's kind of funny how.
And part of what has, I think, helped him is that peer support, where he did finally find some people who did believe his story. Imagine going your whole life and not making connections with anyone, and then you start to question yourself, and you then don't trust yourself, and that's a whole other thing. If you can't trust yourself, then who can I trust?
And a lot of people, they try to be all tough and, oh man, I don't care what anybody says. I saw what I saw, and that's the way it is. But deep down inside, you do care. You do care what other people think, and you want people to believe you. You can put on this big false front if you want to. If that helps you shield yourself from any abuse or whatever.
Yeah.
But the fact is, you're looking for answers.
Well, and that's a human thing. In any, if you think about someone experiencing domestic violence who tries to tell their story, and their family's like, no, he's really nice. No, he wouldn't do that to you. And like, now they're questioning, like, am I just crazy? Did I not experience that with my partner? And so not only are they experiencing trauma with their partner, but now they're experiencing trauma because nobody's believing them. And you start to question yourself, and that messes with you. Absolutely. So having that peer support where you have had other people experience this and can tell you, like, no, you're not crazy. This does exist. This happened to me. That's super therapeutic. It's not therapy, but it's therapeutic, for sure.
So there are some people out there that need some campfire therapy.
And that, after doing crisis intervention with Wyandotte, and every young person I met with was psychotic, and it's a lot of immediate, what can we do in the moment to help relieve some of the stress and anxiety so that we can bring you down a notch. That can be really helpful, especially when you think about these contexts where you're trying to do research too, because what we know about the brain is that logical thinking, problem solving, goal setting, that all happens in the prefrontal cortex. That is the front part of our brain. That's also the first part of our brain to shut down if you are experiencing any sort of stress or anxiety. So when you are in these moments, even though you're kind of keeping it calm, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of nervousness, there's a lot of energy, that to keep this front part of your brain online so that you can make good choices about what to do moving forward is crucial. So being able to put into practice things like some diaphragmatic breathing, shaking out some of that energy, these are all things that can be really helpful in the moment to bring you back into your body and turn the prefrontal cortex back on so that you can make good decisions.
All right, well, I like what was said here today. It mirrors everything we talked about last night. I don't know if there's any part of the subject that we haven't covered today that we covered last night.
I don't think I think that was everything, for sure.
All right, well, I hope everybody enjoyed this. I know I did. It's
Thank you.
Really interesting to hear a smart person's perspective, the possible brain function of these creatures that we're dealing with, and how they are very closely related to us. Mm-hmm. And not many of us have gone outside of using biologists and anthropologists, but how many people have used a psychologist to think of it from what their brains may be capable of, rather than from a biology standpoint, mm-hmm. which is the study of animals.
Well, right. And again, thinking about the brain structure, and when we think about if we are living in survival mode, like perhaps Bigfoot is, because that
We're
they're
encroaching.
just, but they're just trying to survive each day. Gotta find food, where am I gonna have shelter? That's survival. So they're gonna be paying more attention the way any human who's living in survival mode will be paying hyper aware of what's going on. And that, I just feel like that makes a lot of sense to apply more human behavior theory than animal behavior theory to how these
All right, well, everybody, let me know in the comments below what you think about taking this subject into this arena with her. If you'd like to see more of this, then maybe we can touch on this subject, as more things develop in the future.
Thank you.